All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our series, Embrace This Moment. Carrie, can you advance to the next slide? Thanks. So before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping bits. This webinar is being recorded and the presentations will be available on our website very soon. The chat feature allows you to openly discuss with the panelists and other attendees. And then the Q&A feature at the bottom allows you to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will address the questions at the end of each presentation. And during our panel discussion, we'll likely bring those questions into our discussion as well. Please make sure that the questions are relevant, webinar appropriate, and general in nature. If we're unable to answer your question live, we will connect you via email after the webinar. So here is our agenda for today. The title of today is A Holistic View of Clinical Trials. I'm super excited about the panelists that we have on today. We're going to have some really great conversations. So sit tight and get ready for that in just a bit. Carrie is going to come on in just a moment and give us some updates around Cure Duchenne and some of the announcements that we have as well. We also have an on-demand presentation that's available on our website now called DMD Clinical Trials and Overview that Friends put on for us. So it's a great piece of information on just clinical trials in general. And then we'll jump into our panel discussion, followed by presentations from eTel Pharmaco and PTC Therapeutics. Carrie?
Hi, Tiff. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to everybody for being on today. I have a couple brief announcements and updates from Cure Duchenne. So I want to talk today about our Cure Duchenne one-to-one program. It's our family guidance program. I know a lot of you have probably had one-to-one meetings with us, whether it be people from our science and research team, our physical therapy, the parents on our team. But we really want you to kind of reach out to cares@cureduchenne.org and know that we are here for those one-to-one calls. This is an opportunity where we can really talk, less general like a webinar, and more that special individualized attention, completely unbiased from experts within the community. So please take advantage. The contact information is up there. Next, very exciting. So we have relaunched the Duchenne Exchange. Not only is it a website, it is also an app. And this is the hub for all, Duchenne parents and caregivers and clinicians and researchers to come and ask questions and talk on the forums that are topic specific. So you're going to get very dialed in answers. A lot of resources on here, as well as very exciting, and relevant to today, a clinical trial finder where you're able to, now kind of navigate in an easier, more user-friendly way and set alerts for the clinical trials that are meaningful to you and your family. So please check out the Duchenne Exchange. We hope to see you on there. We'll be kind of moderating and chatting with people. So that's up and running now, DuchenneExchange.org. Registration is free. And these are our medical ID bracelets. So I know we've had these for a little while, but it's always nice to mention if anybody is new to Cure Duchenne or new on this webinar. These are free to individuals with Duchenne right now, so you can go on our website. And these are waterproof bracelets that operate via QR code, and the EMS professionals and clinicians can access emergency information via this bracelet. You can also, it has preloaded Duchenne information, emergency info, but you can also put, your son or daughter's individualized information in there so that they know, any history, prescriptions, allergies, etc. It's a fantastic way to have some peace of mind. And lastly, I just want to talk about a little bit of fundraising at Cure Duchenne. So, we are always looking for families to get involved with us. Deborah Miller says this all the time, action is therapy. So do get involved with us, start an online fundraiser, host one, social media fundraisers, Amazon Smile. There's tons of ways to get involved. So cureduchenne.org/fundraising is where you can kind of reach out, download our fundraising toolkit, and we'll help you out through every part of the process. We're here for you. Next, today we also, have an on-demand presentation available with our webinar. So we started doing this so we could cut down a little time on the live portion, but still have a robust amount of information surrounding the topic. Today, we have on our website, cureduchenne.org/webinars. TRINS was able to put together a fantastic presentation about DMD clinical trials. It's Lauren Morganroth and then Anna Christensen, who is also on our panel today. Some of the topics are up here, but it really is for families who want to peek behind the curtain at the processes that happen with clinical trials and learn a little bit more about that. Today's panel discussion will be complementary to this, but you won't be missing any information if you haven't seen this presentation yet, but you can go on and watch it at your leisure. And I am very excited to introduce our panelists for today. So Tiffany, who you know and love, she is going to be moderating the panel today. Tiffany is a certified SLP. She was in the public school setting for 25 years. Tiffany's son Will was diagnosed with Duchenne in 2007, and she's also a carrier. And she is dedicated to helping families and others within the community find the silver linings. And we know she does that often on these webinars. So thanks, Tiff, for moderating today. Next, Anna Christensen, who I just mentioned, she's the lead project manager in TRINS's strategic solutions. So she's been working in pediatric clinical research for 15 years, in neuromuscular research for 12. She joined TRINS in 2018. Her work is centered on engaging families and communities in rare disease clinical trials and research studies. And Anna will also be giving the presentation on behalf of eTel Pharmaco today as well, just so you know. Carl Morris, PhD, is the CSO at Solid Biosciences. So he oversees the drug development processes. And Solid, if you aren't familiar, is a life science company focused on advancing meaningful therapies to improve the lives of patients living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Very grateful to have them on today. And we have three more. So Leslie Porter, who you might know, is an advocate, caregiver, and facilitator for her family. Her husband is Clint, and she is mother of two precious kids, Grant, age 10, who has Duchenne, and daughter Renna, who is 7. She is also a carrier of Duchenne, and she is an attorney who previously worked as a prosecutor in Oklahoma. Michael Kelly is obviously a chief scientific advisor at Cure Duchenne. A lot of you know him through the one-to-one program, but today he's going to take on a little bit of a different role, and he's going to be on our panel to discuss clinical trials and what surrounds that. And Michaela Walker, MPH, is a project manager for Dr. Stetland, and that is up at KUMC at the neurology department. She manages and coordinates dozens of muscular dystrophy and neuromuscular research studies. Her job is to educate and inform patients of developments in the field and all other research opportunities. So she is definitely a great person to be kind of having this conversation with us today. So I'll have all the panelists come up and unmute yourselves, and Tiffany's going to get the panel started today. Thank you, Tiff.
Thank you, Carrie. What a nice introduction. Appreciate it. Saved my air. You did all the talking.
I know. I was trying to go fast so we have more time for the panel.
Yeah,
all right, I'll let you get started.
All right, thanks so much. And hello, friends. This is so great. I've been looking forward to this discussion today. So thank you again for everyone being on. Coming from such different perspectives and backgrounds, I think this is just going to be a robust conversation. So let's just kind of get us started with a very, very basic question. And I'm just going to open it up to everyone, and whoever wants to take a stab first, jump in. But what is a clinical trial?
Well, I can start first, and hopefully everyone will correct me if I get things wrong. So for those who didn't see the presentation, I think it's important to remember that a clinical trial is an experiment. So it's how you figure out, how you test your idea. And usually your tests with Duchenne, you're usually testing an investigational drug, which means it's a new drug or a new therapy that hasn't been approved to be prescribed yet. And a clinical trial is how you get there. So you have clinical trial visits where you might see physicians and physical therapists and coordinators like Michaela. And the purpose of all those activities are to really collect data that's going to answer your questions. So hopefully the rest of the team can add some more color to this.
I'll add a little bit in, seeing it's got quiet. The first point essentially is that it has become over decades now the gold standard mechanisms by which we get drug approved. And when you're moving anything from a non-clinical environment to approval, we have to understand a whole bunch of parameters as they translate into humans. And the initial stage of looking at a clinical trial is really to investigate the safety and tolerability and things that we call PK, really to do with exposure. But it's that translational nature, typically from preclinical animal models of a disease, to see if it actually is safe in humans initially, and then it is actually efficacious. And then the last thing I'll throw in, because I'm sure there's other comments, it has to be a very controlled clinical environment. We want patients that have very specific requirements for inclusion into the trial. And the reason for that is very clear. We don't want other complications until we advance into late stage trials or it's approved and it goes into a real world environment. In a controlled environment, we're now able to really tease out what an experimental medicine is actually doing as far as efficacy or as far as safety or its tolerability.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you go from PK pharmacokinetics, so trying to understand what happens to the drug when it goes into the body, but there's also pharmacodynamics, what the drug does to the body. So it's really sort of trying to identify what can we measure. So looking at biomarkers in the early stage, biomarkers that can potentially sort of lead to a better understanding of and translatability of the effectiveness, the efficacy, as Mike was saying, of the drug. And as you move on to later stage, really refining that and identifying specific endpoints to highlight what can be achieved and what, based on the mechanism of action of the drug, the expected outcomes would be to either maintain function or enhance function in the patients.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear your take on that, Leslie, as a mom.
Okay,
what is the clinical?
Yeah, as a mom, I was going to say I wasn't going to give a scientific answer. I was going to give more of the answer of you're a packer, facilitator, taxi driver. You have to really plan stuff. There was one night when my son had, I will just say first that my son participated in the Roche anti-myostatin trial from April 2008 to November 2019, and we were at KU Medical Center. So, I mean, for us, that was about a 5 to 6 hour drive. And there was one night when my son had a second grade Veterans Day program that was at school, and that ended at about 8 p.m. and we had trial the next morning. So we went to that program. We stayed at the very last minute that we could, and then we hit the road in the snow and drove to Kansas City. And so as a mom, it is a little different. As a mom, I was trying to get him where he needed to be, but also make sure that he had that second grade experience. And so that's the mom experience of what a clinical trial is.
That's great. That's great. And then
let me just add another bit in there, because Leslie's comment made me think about it as well. First of all, we cannot do clinical trials without participation of the community, and that goes without saying. It's an obvious statement out there. Everyone that we've worked through has totally relied on that. I'll underline again something that Carl and I just talked about. It is difficult to translate either efficacy or safety or PK as you go across animal species, never mind into humans. And so the real horrible truth of clinical trials is the vast majority fail. As we enter phase 1, more than roughly about 90% of those will never make it to approval. And there's lots of reasons for that. And some of it is to do with the difficulty of translating preclinical data and imagining what it's going to do in humans. Others is really that we don't understand human disease very well. And so there's a lot of questions that we're asking that just don't get the right answers for. And so without families involved in this, and again, recognizing that these are experimental medicines, none of this would be successful. So there's a real community need in order to make clinical trials actually work for the ones that get across the finish line.
Yeah, I think you just answered the question before I posed it, Michael, which is why are trials so important for our community? I mean, and it's that learning, it's so important for science. It's beyond important. So can you speak a little more to that, Michaela, about the importance of trials?
I'll say a little bit about it, but I don't want to take up all the oxygen. But I will tell you that we all know that, it is difficult translating research, and everybody's heard about the MDX mouse. If we were mice, this disease would have been cured 10 years ago, and we're not. The actual disease, or the phenotype as we call it in mice, is much milder and doesn't follow what we do in humans. And it's not just in Duchenne. Like, I'll speak to the audience and say, You know, you can pick a disease out there from Alzheimer's, starting with A and run all the way through the alphabet, of which we poorly understand the background behind those diseases. And that there's part of the challenge. It's the models that we work with, and then we try and go from the mouse into more severe ones that may be representative of humans, such as the dog. And that's a lot more restrictive for us. But it's those types of challenges, Tiffany, and I'm sure Carl could add in a whole bunch more, but those things make it that extra demand on how we actually have confidence in going into a clinical setting.
Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, Duchenne is incredibly heterogeneous in the phenotype. You know, disease progression is different for each individual boy, you know, and which makes it extremely difficult to sort of walk through the standard process. We try and identify subpopulations, so small groups of boys that seem to be the same. But even with that, we haven't really done a good job as you know, as industry to really sort of be able to predict the trajectories or how the disease progression sufficiently going into a clinical trial, that we don't lose our signal, the sensitivity of the measurement of the effectiveness of the drug because of just individual variability. So that's why, you know, bigger trials are sort of needed. You know, PTC and Roche and Pfizer had quite large trials. You know, for Roche and Pfizer, at least, you know, it didn't pan out. And a lot of that is sort of to do with just the problem that Duchenne is so heterogeneous. There are a lot of activities on the back end, and there's a lot of pre-competitive groups that are working together. A lot of companies and the community, you know, other members of the community are working really hard to try and identify those the predictable measurements and impact. What biomarkers, what things can we measure before patients go into a study to better understand what they're going to look like, what the natural history of the progression looks like as we go through. So then you can measure a treatment effect against that.
And could I jump in and say, again, as kind of the mom on this, is that number one, going into a situation knowing, on one hand, I wanted so much for myostatin to be the thing that my son was going to be on until the next thing, you know, and I went into that with that hope, also with that understanding that so many trials do fail. But I want to point out that the failure in a trial, as far as the kid is concerned and as far as the family is concerned, is still, you're getting a benefit even from the failure. And I maybe in another question it'll come up more, but that understanding that placebo effect, while that is just from like a fake effect, the benefit is a real benefit. And actually, we felt like that my son was on drug. Family members, teachers were saying he's getting the good stuff. We can tell. Well, when it was unblinded, we found out that he was on placebo. And so what he was getting was that placebo effect. That good effect that people saw was still a positive effect. So I don't want families to feel like because so many trials fail that they shouldn't go forward. We are still getting a benefit. And I also have to hand it to science and pharmaceutical companies that they are willing to take on a disease that is so big and is so challenging, because so many times I would try to maybe temper my enthusiasm or temper my hope with the idea that this could be phenotype of my son and that we don't know what his disease progression is going to be versus is it the trial. And so with all those difficulties in mind, I so admire the fact that there are so many really smart people that are out there trying to make these trials go forward, and that we are making progress, even when so many of them fail. And that that placebo effect, you know, there's that thing that if you take a pill, you get one level. If you do more, you get more. So involving yourself in a clinical trial, when my son was getting a weekly injection, he was getting echoes, he was getting pulmonary testing, he was getting DEXA scans, he was getting all these trips to do the lab and all that stuff. And every single thing that we did there helped boost that placebo effect to give him the best possible outcome that he could have, even though we had to deal with the grief of the fact that that trial failed and that we then were aged to a period of time where we're kind of in a gray zone about whether or not we can reapply for another trial. But I just want to point out that failure should not be something that we're afraid of, because that failure is still making progress, and we as the community are still benefiting from those failures.
And I just want to sort of add, because you talked about failure. So I think the drug can fail and the clinical trial can be successful. If you do the clinical trial properly, then you can leave knowing that unfortunately the drug didn't have the effect or safety profile that you wanted. But the clinical trial should be designed in such a way that can answer that question, at least, as to whether the drug is good or not.
Yeah, exactly. We learn a lot from our failures, and that's the whole purpose of clinical trials, is we're getting our questions answered. They might not always be the answers we anticipated, but we are getting the answers to our questions, and we're furthering our knowledge about the disease as well. So not only are we learning about, the drug that we might be using, but then we do gain more knowledge about our patients.
That was terrific. I'm over here with goosebumps. And from a family perspective, as my son will be 21 in a couple of months, just to be contributing. Like I'm a carrier. I go to my doctor and I'm like, what do you need? You need blood? You need urine? What do you need? You can have it all. Like, just to know that I'm part of the science. And will it help me specifically or my son? I don't know. But the fact that we're in this together and, building this community and surrounding with helping continue to move it forward. I think it's just so important. So how about we go to the next question? This is great. So we all know trials are very competitive as well. So what advice can you offer to families who are trying to get on wait lists or connect with clinicians and coordinators or get prepped to be eligible for a study? I'm going to kind of throw this one to you, Michaela, and to get us kicked off in this conversation.
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that yes, trials can be competitive, but not all trials are competitive when it comes to enrollment. So it really does depend on the research trial. So when you are talking to a study team, be sure to ask about that. Because some trials have enrollment that is staggered throughout the study, while others might have bursts of enrollment throughout the study, and some are dose tolerance studies. So not all studies are going to necessarily be competitive. But as far as how to get on wait list and, connecting with clinicians and coordinators and the people like me, there are really two great places to start. I would say your number one place is going to be in the clinic and asking your neurologist, what's going on in the field and what, your son might be eligible for, mainly because your neurologist knows you best. So they know your situation, and they're going to know what you might qualify for as far as trials. But the second best place to go to find out about research studies is going to be clinicaltrials.gov. It has all of the research studies that are going on in the US and many outside the US, and it's going to have contact information to each of the sites that are doing the study. So call whoever is closest to you and get more information about the trial, and that's really the best way to get started.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I would say the other thing to know is that most of the protocols are designed assuming you are getting really great Duchenne care. So once you've told your team, I'm interested in research, and once you've looked at clinicaltrials.gov, the next best thing you can do is stay up to date on your clinical care. So that means going to your visits, doing your heart test, doing all the stuff that the doctors are on you to do. And it means staying on top of your stretching, because some of the studies have rules about you can't have contractures and all those things. And really, even if you do nothing else, doing that will really help you, because I saw someone in the Q&A was saying, the criteria are so tight, and that's really true. And it's because a lot of these studies in Duchenne are trying to see if the investigational drug could be safe. And so you start with a smaller group, and then sometimes they're looking at, does it work? And you need to find the little narrow group where you think it might work the best or the quickest or the most obviously. And but no matter which one it is, most of these studies are designed assuming you're up to date on your care. So that's the number one thing I tell families all the time.
I mean, I'll just add to the inclusion criteria thing. A lot of that comes back to one sort of safety and making sure that the kids are sort of healthy enough to be part of a study. But the second thing is really to make sure that there are things we know about heterogeneity. And so we want to sort of still maintain, getting back to my theme here, that to be as homogeneous as possible to test the drug in this disease.
Well, I mean, if I could say again, I'm sorry, I'm always going to butt in as the parent perspective here, but we didn't go through any of these decisions on our own. Number one, we have a really great neurologist and a great team, and we had some ideas about what we thought would be good. And when we talked to her, Dr. Wong, I'm plugging her big time. When we talked to her, we decided that maybe we were going in the wrong direction. So we talked to her, we scheduled an appointment. Mike Kelly gave us a one-on-one, and we got to go over with him what we thought and what our questions were. So my experience and what I would say to each of us is we are really knowledgeable about our kids' disease, but this is a really complex disease with a lot of systems involved. And we have access to experts who will help us with this and take advantage of those choices. That way you're feeling like you're in the best trial for your kid at that moment.
You can interject anytime, Leslie.
Great. Good, I will.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, I think, knowledge is power. All those cliche things are just so true. And so you really need to arm yourself with as much information and go and ask the experts. That's what they're there for. So, so important. Yeah, can't highlight that enough. Let's move to our next question. Speaking of getting into a trial and being in there, what kind of sacrifices can be associated with participating in a trial? And then what are the benefits from participating? I'll kind of look to you, Anna, to get us started off on that one. And I know Leslie will jump in.
Okay,
too.
good.
Well.
Yeah, so Leslie can cover the mom stuff. That would be awesome because I don't have that experience. But, I think it depends a lot on the trial. And I think this kind of gets to the question of how do you find the right trial or whatever, because some studies, it's a really big ask. Some studies, you might need to stay in a hospital overnight. You might need to stay within so many miles of your center. You might need to go to visits once a week. You might have multi-day visits. You might travel to multiple centers. And other studies who are looking at different questions might have a lighter schedule, or they may have centers that are closer to you, or it may be happening at the center that you go to for your Duchenne care. And so I think it's important to ask those questions. And I would say, that if you haven't heard it already, it is okay to say that this study doesn't work for me because I can't make it fit into my life. So a study that works for me is not going to be the same as a study that works for you. And sometimes that's okay to say that that one isn't a good fit. Because I think it's good to ask your site, how long do these visits take? When are they scheduled for? Does it always have to be on Tuesday morning at 7 a.m.? Like, there's all these logistical pieces that will help you understand what the burden could be. In terms of the benefits, it is important to remember that the trial is designed to answer a question, right? So there's never any guarantee that you're going to get a benefit from a drug. The piece that is that you may notice is you may be seeing a Duchenne team with more experience in research than you normally would see. And so sometimes that can create a bridge so that you can meet somebody new, and that can be a really positive thing. The other piece I would say is that, let's say you sign up for a trial and you screen, and then you screen fail, which means that your test results weren't good enough or were too good or something for your screening visit. And I would say that a lot of the studies use the similar tests. So if you're somebody who did a screening visit and you failed, your kid has now had some practice with that test. So the next study, it won't be so scary and so new, and they will have their best possible chance of qualifying. So I don't know, those are my opening thoughts about sort of the benefits and the costs. But I'm sure Leslie and Michaela will talk our ear off about it, hopefully.
Well, I think what Leslie said earlier about, having, it's basically an extra layer of care is what it really is. You're having this extra layer of care from whatever you're normally doing. So, you are getting potentially extra MRIs, extra DEXA scans, extra labs done. You're seeing a doctor more frequently than you would just going, once or twice a year. So really, I think that is like the added benefit of being in a clinical trial is you are seeing the doctor more and a care team more. So you're just getting more care.
Yeah, I mean, it's a significant burden. Sponsors like us try and get as much information out of it as possible, right? So that means more tests and more visits and more this. We try and load it on as much as we can, sort of keeping the patient voice in mind, obviously. But so it's a really important decision to make, and it has to be right for you as a family to make that. Because once you're in there, the one thing that we can plead for is to see it through, because you're part of a program that's trying to answer a question. So figuring out later that the burden is too great for your specific situation, sort of puts more duress on everyone else sort of going through that, because they'll need to recruit more and it's delayed longer, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's a really important decision. Everyone's sort of communicating, speak with your physician, do the right thing up front, make sure it's okay for you and right for you, but really be once you're in it, stick with it, because it's eventually the benefit should be outweighing any sort of burden that comes from being a participant in a clinical trial.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit on top of Carl's there, because I think industry fully recognizes the enormous ask that it's making of these patients. In other diseases where people are free to travel and it's not an impediment on them, then, we can list a whole bunch of diseases in there, but Duchenne is not one of them. And the ask that we're really making here, is one where we want people to be part of this and stay all the way through, while we learn whether the safety, the tolerability, or the mechanism is applicable to this disease. And I think, the patients themselves recognize that their families are really cognizant of the fact that they're participating in something much, much bigger. And it really is a sacrifice that they're putting into this. Given also the fact that there's also the roll of the dice in some of these trials, whether they'll be on an effective drug or on a placebo arm, and patients are still prepared to participate in that. And I think it really shows that the community is not only really knowledgeable, but actively involved in this whole process, because they recognize that we can't do this without them being engaged in this, independent of whatever the risk and the benefit is.
Well, so then as to risks and benefits, starting with the bad news, I thought it was important for maybe families who haven't done this before to give them the part that I was surprised by. And that was, we were doing something that was positive. We were doing something that was helpful. And yet at every stage, I had to deal with anxiety and a grief. There was a grief piece to every aspect of it that I wasn't expecting. It came at times that I didn't expect. I listed some of them that I knew I struggled with, not knowing if we were on drug or not. I had a grief piece about that, that we might miss. We started this in this trial, and we might miss an opportunity for something like gene therapy. That was something I worried about, that all that extra testing, while that is beneficial, it can also take a toll on Grant, that we were asking a lot of him. One thing that was a big thing that I worried about was whether my kids' memories were going to be that they spent their childhoods in doctor's office and traveling for medical visits. And that's something that I just didn't want my kids to feel like. The one thing as a parent that was the worst part for me was the questionnaires that I had to fill out all the time, the questionnaires that asked about my psychological well-being, Grant's psychological well-being, as well as where he was in his disease process. Can he pick up a gallon of milk? Can he pick up a heavy book? These things, while I know I'm living with a disease that is progressive, I don't always have to look in the mirror and see the tolls that it's taking. But those questionnaires made me look at the situation, made me look at the process, and that was really hard. And some days that made me really mad. And some days I wrote snarky little remarks in the borders that said, I feel this way because of these questions, not because of, so I just want to say that I think if I had known that going in, I could have been a little bit more prepared for those feelings. Now I want to switch to the good part, to the benefits, and the benefits were huge too. And for us, it was the first trip that we made that was a road trip from Oklahoma to Cincinnati to go see Dr. Wong. That it was horrible. I hated it. It was very stressful. We were exhausted. We were stressed out. We did nothing but fun. And all we did was stay in different Hampton Inns. It was like a blur. And I think after that trip, I made this decision that we were not going to have kids that remembered the doctor. We were going to have kids that remembered adventures. And so after that first trip to Cincinnati, I kind of made it my goal that we are going to have a trip that's an adventure, that maybe we'll go see the doctor while we're there. And so because we had that outlook on it, we ended up, our memory of Kansas City and of going to the clinical trial are filled with all the fun things we did. At the trial site, the coordinators helped us develop a list that was all the, it was a bucket list of all the things we could do for fun in Kansas City. And we had fun marking those off every time. And actually my kids, now that the trial is over, have come to me and said, we want to go back to Kansas City. And so I am really proud of that they aren't looking at it as that we just were going to the doctor. They're looking at it as all the fun things that we did. And so for that, that's what I want to say is a huge benefit that we get from it. So those are my answers to that one.
Yeah, can I just say that that's super to hear that there, from the other side where I never hear that, the family-oriented opinion about all of this. The thing that I would share to contrast it is I've been involved in drafting and in meetings putting together these clinical trial protocols for Duchenne muscular dystrophy for many of them over the last many years. And they're not written in a sterile office with the CMO on his own. Every time this has been done, there's been an enormous amount of impact from patients and advocates, and they're brought in to talk through, all of the different components of this and how we can make it easier. And so that's front and center in the way that industry's thinking about this here, because they know that it wouldn't work without doing that there.
Wasn't always the case, right, Mike? But I think over the last 10 years or so, it's really the patient voice is being sort of at that table from the get-go and throughout the process.
Mike, to that
yeah, we do
point,
that at TAC. At every TAC meeting we have the patient voice and advocacy groups are in there speaking first to the companies about the disease burden and what it actually means, and that there's felt all the way through to the drafting of clinical trial protocols.
Mm-hmm. And is that something that you do, Michaela, when you're bringing a new family in for a new trial? Do you front load them at all, like to say, hey, this packet of information is going to ask you some pretty intense questions, or what's kind of the standard of just front loading that information and kind of prepping families for it?
So it does. Usually we try to have a couple of preliminary conversations before we bring someone into a clinical trial. And we do try to let parents know that sometimes the questionnaires are very awkward or very tedious, or you feel uncomfortable asking them. So I think we've gotten a lot better about that in the last couple of years, and preparing parents, especially with the younger boys too, because it's a little bit harder to ask a 5-year-old, how you're doing in certain areas, or, if you're having anxiety or things like that. So I think we're getting better, but yeah, you have to let parents know that ahead of time that we are asking these hard questions, and the answers are important, is because actually what they're using those quality of life questionnaires for is that they're trying to see, is there a change over time? Are you guys noticing things at home that are changing that we might be not catching when you come into the clinic? So they are really important, but they can be definitely uncomfortable. So that's something we try to prepare families for at the beginning, especially if there's like a tablet or a phone or something where you're doing it almost every day, especially a study like that.
Let's kind of get into decision making. Families, I'm at a different juncture with my son as compared to Leslie and Grant. So, and I'm going to look to you, Mike, kind of to guide this conversation. Just what are some general decision making strategies that families can do at different junctures of the journey? Younger, older boys, rare mutations. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, super question. I think it's particularly pertinent to new families that come into the disease, because they're just looking across the therapeutic map on clinicaltrials.gov, and they're trying to say, what can I get my son into? Not really recognizing that the therapies are really designed for different stages of the disease. So for older boys, we're more concerned with antifibrotic agents and things like that. And for younger boys, anti-inflammatory agents or gene therapies more focused in there. I think there's, for certain percentages of the population, where you've really got certain types of deletions that's amenable to exon skipping. We've now got a couple of approved drugs, and that there's 51 and 53 are good examples of that. But for many others, it's really educating parents not just about what's important as the disease changes. It's a very different disease in a 5-year-old versus a 9-year-old versus a 19-year-old. And therefore, the approach and the therapy and the questions that you're asking in a clinical setting are going to be very different indeed. And that is what we have to educate parents about. I spend quite a bit of my time, talking to parents about where their son is on the natural history curve, and therefore why certain clinical trials are leveraging into that type of information. And I think really knowing one's mutation is an important part of this. So that genetic information, the genetic background is critical in some decision making, but it's principally age and understanding where they are on the natural history curve and what therapies out there are directly applicable to that. And I think that's the most important aspect that we can do as we start to talk about the disease and individual patients in this here. And I think that there really helps parents focus in on that area that's important to them and asking the right sort of questions. That's the way I would work that there.
And kind of how we guide parents and patients is it really is kind of how you're saying on what stage it is. So usually if they're younger, parents are very focused on keeping them walking and keeping them moving. So, we might have a look for a drug study that might be, that's the goal, or what Michael was saying with the gene modifying therapies. So if they have a specific deletion or mutation, we will usually favor families towards something that's actually going to be gene modifying and actually address their mutation. But if there isn't something else out there, then we would look for something that to help keep them ambulatory. And then also, like he said before, once you get to that later stage, it's the antifibrotics, helping with contractures, things like that. So it really is about where they're at in the disease stage of what is going to be their best option for a clinical trial.
Yeah, and I think to Mike's point too, it's super, super important to understand your genetic mutation like that. If we can't share that enough out to families, to know your mutation and to really understand it, I think that's really key in how to navigate, the pipeline.
And
yeah, the thing that I will say too, oh, sorry, go ahead. I'll talk in a second.
I was just going to say, you are going to have it. Pretty much all clinical trials are going to require confirmed genetic diagnosis showing that you have Duchenne. So that is going to be the number one thing we're going to need from you before we'll get you into a trial.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I've been, as you know, interacting with the Duchenne community for quite a number of years and having, talking to many parents out there. What I find is they've got really deep knowledge about some of the science that's out there. Everybody's Googled the heck out of CRISPR and Cas, and parents understand it and know it. They just don't know how to apply it, but they're asking lots of questions around the right sort of thing. The thing that's becoming more and more pertinent today, you can almost take a poll on what parents are Googling. Like right now, it's monoclonal antibodies, or it's really to do with neutralizing antibodies to AAV. So parents are at the forefront of this as much as we are, and I think our role is really to guide them into what that knowledge really means and translate that into the right sort of questions for them.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, my point on this was just having realistic hopes, and that's really difficult. I mean, I get the feeling a lot that there is a giant clock that's ticking over our heads, and that we feel it, and when Grant turned 10, that was a hard age to turn. We were so excited about all this promise. And with each age, you start to see it's still very exciting and it's still very hopeful, but you also have to imagine that all that hope may not be able to be felt by your own kid. And so that's something that's really difficult. And my advice on that is that I find that every neurological appointment, there is something maybe that Dr. Wong says that I think I've got a question to that, but I'm not ready for the answer. And so just kind of take your time with it and understand, be gentle with yourself. And that even though it's really hard, I mean, right now, my son's 10, he has a single point mutation. He could benefit from exon skipping therapy. He could benefit from microdystrophin. He could benefit from CRISPR. And yet those things aren't available to him right now. That's hard. And so I have to sometimes take a step away and not be so upset about that. And instead try to appreciate that there is progress being made, and that hopefully I don't have a crystal ball in my anxiety-ridden mind, about what we're going to be able to have access to at some point for Grant, that it hopefully will make some sort of impact on Grant's life, even if it isn't the same for what it is for young kids. And so I just want to, I think realistic hopes is a good thing. Don't lose out on that hope and what that could mean, but try to also don't expect maybe miracles. Have an understanding about what we can reasonably hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I just reiterate that, you really want to be educating yourself constantly about both the disease, but also what new developments are coming out. And engaging with the patient advocacy groups, we as industry sort of try and give them updates as soon as we can, and so they will know sort of what's going on. So I think it's really about surrounding yourself with a lot of information that can help guide you to what is coming. And I think it's tough because you don't want to know too much. You may not want to know the answers, but you need to know what the questions are, and whether you decide to ask. But if you don't know what the questions are, you can't ask those questions. So education is sort of really key.
Absolutely. And I agree, Leslie, there's realistic expectations. That's so important and so hard to do. So, yeah. But just to be mindful of it and to label it as such, that's the first step. So, yeah.
Tiffany, one final comment in this little section. It's the recognition that clinical trials are slow. It takes time. Drug development is really slow. And that really is painful. That's the truth of the matter. We can't do this overnight. There's lessons that we might be able to learn from vaccine development and COVID that we can apply, and we're seeing some emergency use authorizations, but that's not going to happen overnight in this disease. If I take you back a handful of years, there was 1 or 2 companies involved. Today, there's a plethora, and there's like a significant number of clinical trials, pushing the edges of science and technology, and that's what gives me confidence. We've got the right people involved, the right companies involved. We've got money behind them, public companies that have got access to both human capital as well as financial capital. And I take real confidence from that there. It doesn't mean that every program's going to work. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to work faster. But right now, we're pushing an envelope that's beyond what we done 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
I agree, but I'll sort of bring it a little bit back to throw a little bit of caution in that despite the wonderful sort of pipeline for Duchenne, we're still dealing with very small numbers that actually go into the clinical trials and sort of go into these experiments. And so to sort of manage those expectations more broadly, we really have to just sort of keep that in mind, that the gene therapy clinical trials are sort of hundreds, right? So but there's thousands of boys who could benefit, and so we do have to balance the expectations as we go forward.
Mm-hmm.
Well said. This next question I have, we're kind of doing it already. How can the different stakeholders in the clinical trials work together to reach the common goal? Well, right now, what we're doing today with patient advocacy organization, a family, industry, scientists, the guys on this panel right now, this is an indication of how do we improve, is we work together and we listen to the patient voice and we understand all aspects. But I'd love to, hear some of your insights, Carl, and then turn it over to the rest.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about this topic in general, and what we're doing here is, as you said, is a perfect example. But there are a lot of we call them pre-competitive consortium or industry consortia, or I know I'm sitting on a number of different sort of community-based things that are outside the scope of our specific drug. So how can we improve outcome measures in Duchenne? How can we get regulators involved? And there was a great pathway consortium meeting that happened where I think there were 14 members of the FDA sitting listening to a panel of experts talking about what can we do to move clinical development forward for Duchenne. Including Peter Marks, who's the head of CBER. So, there are a lot of these activities that are ongoing. So patient advocacy is there, regulators are there, industry's there, the academic the neurologists. So I think we're doing it. We have to try and sort of maintain as much as we can the openness and the transparency. Clearly, asset specific or drug specific things we can't really talk about as much, but there are immunology issues, and I'm part of a meeting that's sort of being developed for immunology for gene therapy, and not just Duchenne, but more broadly, high dose AAV. So there are a lot of things that are coming into play that we need to continue with. Mike and I both talked about having the patient voice sitting front and center in protocol development. So I think there's there are a lot of these activities that are really sort of driving and getting sort of how to get, once we're through that early stage clinical, how can we get the drugs to the market as quickly as possible? How can we sort of get it to patients who aren't the 20% who are part of the advocacy groups and listen into these things. There's a significant number of other underserved members of this community that we have to consider and figure out how best to move forward. I'll stop now.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit into CARS. There's various stakeholders, I think, that have changed the way that we're looking at Duchenne right now. And this actually started a number of years ago to get us where we are today. And it really involves a shared understanding of the natural history that was developed in various clinical trials and clinical centers, all the way in various countries and within different companies. And they've come together to share that analyze that natural history over the last few years. And that there's been a driver of how we understand clinical trials, how we actually understand endpoints, how we power a study appropriately. And that data has been shared with the FDA. And so it's another good example of lots of different stakeholders have come together for a common cause, because everybody's benefited from that, their real better improved understanding of natural history.
Perfect. Any other input, Michaela?
So we are doing something like this, but it's not with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's with a different muscular dystrophy for adults, or typically in adults. So what we did is we created a consortium, and then we started making focus groups about things that we wanted to look at in the field. So like we have a biomarker working group, we have an MRI imaging working group, we have remote assessment. So that's what we started doing to try to look at the things that we want to do in the field, and then start focusing in on what are our questions and how do we want to proceed. And so those focus groups include patient advocacy groups. It includes big pharma, academic researchers, some of those preclinical scientists. So we really tried to bring everyone to the field so we could say, what needs to still be done, what are our questions, and what's the path forward. And then we even started actually getting some of our patient advisory council involved as well.
Great, bringing everyone together. That's the thing, communication is key. I have a couple of more questions. So, this kind of came up a little bit earlier in conversation regarding when trials are discontinued. Maybe we could just dig a little bit deeper into that. How do they still advance science and research for the community, even those failed trials? So would you like to kick us off with that one, Anna? Can't hear you. I can read your lips. There we go.
There we go. Try now. I was double muted. Sorry, I dropped off. My connection was terrible. So yeah, one of the things that can happen is that you'll get to the end of the trial and you'll learn that the drug didn't do what you thought it would do. And you ask this question of, does it do a certain thing, or is it safe enough? And the answer can be no. And so families will get a contact from their site principal investigator or coordinator or both, and walk them through some procedures. And then it can feel like nothing happens. But one of the things that makes research really special in Duchenne is that a lot of the companies make plans up front to share their data in some ways with some different data sharing consortiums. And it's really neat, because what it means is when the next company comes down the pipeline, they can get access to this kind of data to figure out if their question is likely to succeed or not. And they can do that way before they ever launch a study. And so that can make a big difference. And it especially is helpful when you have people in the placebo group, because these are people who are getting the same kinds of tests. They had the same kind of hope. They were just as excited as their other peers, and other companies can leverage that data. So there's several different initiatives on that a lot of the companies in Duchenne participate in. So I think that's important for families to know. In addition, and that's sort of in addition to the general improvement in knowledge that you have no matter what disease it's in, that you've answered a question and you know that the answer is no. And it allows companies to move forward in a different direction that can help them stop wasting time on an area that maybe won't be fruitful, that they can direct their resources somewhere else. So those are the two things, but the data sharing aspect is really great and sort of unique to Duchenne.
I'll add a little comment in there. The good thing about this is a lot of information is published whenever it's in a clinical trial environment. And so we do learn, everybody learns from each other's mistakes. And that's a great thing about science, so that's an important aspect. But to back it up just a little bit, when programs fail early, and we try and make them fail early because we don't want to put the burden on patients for things that may not work, or we don't want to spend the money on things that may not work. Patients are precious in here. If they fail early, they tend to fail for things to do with pharmacokinetics or things to do with the safety and tolerability of a drug, because they're the hard things to predict. That there's usually in a phase 1 environment, and that's where a vast majority of projects, whenever they first enter the clinic, will fail. And we don't learn a lot from that. We learn not to do that again, or we learn to try and kill it quicker, or we learn to try and sort of predict animal models a little bit more like humans, but we don't learn a lot about the disease. And it's only when we move into that phase 1B or phase 2 environment where we're asking a question about the mechanism of the drug. Because at that point, we know that it's relatively safe for short-term dosage and that it's probably engaging the target. And if it doesn't work, then we really learn that that mechanism doesn't work in this disease. And that there's really an important thing, because that changes the landscape, not just for the drug developer, but for everybody that's out there. That information gets out very quickly. And so there's a lot that we learn from failures within clinical trials, depending upon what stage that it's at.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just echo both points there. I think the placebo data that a consortia like CTAP in Duchenne, they're now publishing comparisons to natural history versus placebos, from these data, which is it's sort of wonderful, and the regulators see that. So there could be some convincing, down the line, if enough people sort of get behind it, to sort of try and change the trajectory on placebos in Duchenne trials. So those are it's very powerful, and you're right, sort of shutting down a mechanism and not going after the same mechanism again is also of incredible value. And then the final thing is really, you get more familiarity with what endpoints will work, what doesn't work, as you sort of go forward. So you can start thinking through better designs for the upcoming studies. So, again, clinical trials generally don't fail. It's the drugs, and a successful clinical trial with an unfortunate drug failure is sort of a good thing, in terms of getting that information.
And I would just add, that even when trials fail, they're teaching us, they're narrowing that possibility, and they're moving that target forward. And then of paramount importance to me as a mom is that my son felt like he had done something important. He felt like he had helped his community. He felt like he had helped himself. He felt like he learned that he was really brave. And, it's just, that was a positive thing for him to get from that. And so even if he doesn't have another opportunity to do that, he has that knowledge that he did that. Also, that I know that specifically for the myostatin, it was really hard to hear that didn't help. But the stuff that they did learn from that failure was that it was the steroids that had made an impact on that. So maybe that's something that could be revisited again someday, so that the information it's not lost. The information, we can use it to move that target forward, and I think that's important.
Well said. And you also learned that your kids want to go back for some more adventures.
That's right.
Well, this has been terrific. I have one more question I'm going to pose just to close this up here. And, I'm looking at the year and reflecting personally. My son was diagnosed with Duchenne 14 years ago. And at that time, there was nothing. I looked at what in the world. And my hope was that we could have something in the future that will help these guys. And here we are, fast forward. And wow, I never would have envisioned how much is there now. So it's fabulous. But, let's go from now and look to the future, right? And I'm going to turn this one to you, Leslie. And, what are your hopes for the future of trials and progress in the community?
I mean, I have a huge hope, right? I mean, we have the same vested kind of hope.
Yeah.
I hope that trials, I guess I want to speak to it a little bit in a way of my 10-year-old son. I hope that, number one, for him, he can do another trial. We want to do that. If nothing else, even if it's another failed drug, I want to see that placebo effect again. That's an awesome thing. And let's ride that wave as long as we can. I want to see that that trials can open themselves up more. I understand. I mean, I have an understanding of the difficulty, especially with this disease, that we've got so many mutations in so many ways that our bodies or their bodies express those mutations. However, I also hope that as a community, we're going to find more and more ways for more of the community to be able to be involved in clinical trials, and its importance in so many things psychologically. Just there are so many things that I think are very important in this, and I hope that we find ways to open that up to more ages and to more mutations. I hope that we start to look at trial design a little differently. I hope that we look at maybe just not the North Star, but try to look at other ways that we can measure success and possible benefits of drugs. I hope that I can continue to also focus on those positives, like you said, of how far it's come. And I think it's really important for us to all remember that too, that even as difficult as it is, and as much as I also feel the pressure of that clock, it is coming. Things are coming to fruition that are really amazing. And we should just take a second and stop and be grateful for that. And then I just hope, that the community will continue to be all we are, that we'll continue to be involved and continue to participate in this so we can all get there together.
That was beautiful.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of comments in, because I think that just sort of, like, I'm sure everybody's got their own thoughts about this. We're at a really interesting time in drug development in this disease. There's a ton of real companies that really know how to do drug development involved, and I can make you the long list of who that is. Regulators know the disease and they know how to get drugs approved. We've got a much better understanding of natural history today than we did a decade ago. So all the basic ingredients are there in order to accelerate what we're doing. And I got to say that I personally am optimistic about what's been achieved over the last 5, 6, 7 years. You've seen that acceleration and everything. As I step back and look at it, like as enthused as I am, we see gaps and weaknesses that are going to be apparent over the next few years, and that's what we're continuing to look at. Ways to improve the efficiency of exon skipping, are ways for gene therapy to get around the whole AAV issue and neutralizing antibodies issue, to use non-viral delivery tools. Like, there's a lot of things out there that we see are going to be gaps over the next few years. But right now, I think that we can rejoice on the foundation that's been built over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And I think we're going to see a sweeping change, particularly the work that Carl's group's doing, for example, on gene therapy. We're optimistic on gene therapy, but we're still got one eye to how to make things better and what we need to see out there so that all boys can be treated. So I think this is a great time to look at that. And then with the reality check that I always throw in, thinking about there's still a lot more that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best time to be in Duchenne, so to speak, because there is a lot happening. We all have to be smarter and about what we do, how we do things. We haven't solved anything yet, but let's we're closer than we've been in the past, and I think as Mike said, this is a good time. I know personally and you know, among my colleagues sort of throughout the community, there's a ton of dedication here to sort of try and solve this problem and get as much treatment, as many treatments as quickly as possible to as many kids as possible.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss to not say our slogan, "Together we will cure Duchenne." It just was so fitting to say it just now. So I firmly believe that and appreciate everyone. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful to all of you for participating and sharing with the community. I can't thank you enough. So appreciate it. All right, well, take care. We're going to move on to our next point on the agenda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I want to thank Cure Duchenne for inviting me to speak on behalf of PTC Therapeutics. My name is John Wing. I am a lead medical science liaison. If you haven't met me before, I've been around a little bit with the community, but my background is in molecular and cellular biology. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the company, but you know, I tend to come from a scientist background, so if I have that slant, hopefully you can appreciate it. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to tell you a little bit about the company and who we are. We always say it's a small biotech company, but we're growing. We were established in 1998, and we're based in South Plainfield, New Jersey. I happen to be up here in Boston, so if my accent comes out, you know, I apologize for that. But we're actively engaged in the discovery, development, and commercialization of best-in-class therapies in areas, as you know, as Duchenne muscular dystrophy, spinal muscular atrophy, gene therapy, and some small programs in oncology. We've grown over the years. We're now actually hit, I believe, over 1,000 employees. So I don't know that we can say that we're necessarily small anymore. But what we do have is a really big commitment to Duchenne in the community. And that's why we're here today in part to speak to you. Next slide, please. So we have what's called a multi-platform approach, and it builds us a diversified pipeline. So you'll see in the upper left, deflazacort or Emflaza, and that's a corticosteroid. It's the only corticosteroid approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then we also have, in a nonsense mutation category, we have Adalurin or Translarna, and some of you may know about that. It's a read-through agent for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It's approved in Europe and other countries around the world. And again, I'll talk more about that in a moment. Recently, we have Evrysdi or risdiplam in partnership with Roche that got approval for spinal muscular atrophy. And then we have some gene therapy programs, some BioE programs, metabolic oncology, and then virology. We have a program for COVID-19. So basically, we have this very diverse platform. But as you can see, we do have a really strong commitment to rare disease and to drug development. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So last year, when I presented to the community, you know, COVID had really just started, and I read this press release verbatim. I'm not going to do that this time, but really what it talks about is our supply chain and how we've really had no problems over the past year during COVID. And so we just wanted to have this slide up here again to, one, show our PTC Cares number. Okay, and that's a number that's 1-844-478-2227. If you have any questions or issues with your Emflaza shipments or access, or any questions at all. But really, we haven't really had any issues with our supply chain throughout the whole COVID you know, year. And personally, I'm eagerly looking forward to seeing everybody face to face at some meetings in the hopefully near future. So next slide, please. So being that today's discussion was about clinical development, I'll give you some information here about our programs and try to put it in context to what you've heard earlier. So really, we do have a history of commitment to Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And from my perspective as a scientist, and I've been working in science since a young lad in 1992, and I'm very proud to work with a company that has developed a molecule like Adalurin, and they discovered that in the late 90s and early 2000s. And they literally have brought that through the various stages of clinical development. And as you heard, most programs fail in phase 1. And for me as a young scientist, we always learned that it just takes one molecule, but that's like a 1 in a billion. That's like a lottery shot or moonshot, as we say at PTC. And so we brought the program through a phase 1, phase 2A, phase 2B, and phase 3 trial process. And along the line, as we mentioned earlier, you heard that there are challenges with understanding the natural history of rare disease. And as these trials were being done, at the same time, we were learning about that natural history of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And so we were looking at and asking the question, is Adalimumab safe and efficacious? And also, what is the natural history of the disease? So in 2015, there's the initial EU approval and renewal for Translarna. Okay, unfortunately, it didn't get approval in the US. And as you may have heard recently, we released some data from a dystrophin production trial that we had. And unfortunately, it didn't meet that P05 p-value, but we did show that numerically we increased levels of dystrophin. And again, challenges with Duchenne is that sometimes these things take time. Sometimes they're challenges you can't anticipate. So we are currently planning, because I know there's always going to be a question about this, but we're currently planning to have discussion with the FDA about Adalimumab in the US, and we're going to hopefully bring to them what we call the totality of evidence for our entire package. Because after the approval in the EU, we also started a registry for patients that are on Adalimumab and have been tracking those patients over the past few years and gaining more evidence and data in support of Adalimumab. So all that information we'll bring to the FDA, and I can't say what that answer is, but hopefully we'll have news in the future. And then also you see that Emflaza got FDA approval in 2017. Well, the trial for Emflaza was actually done back in the early 90s, and then Marathon Pharmaceuticals was the group that brought that data through the FDA approval process, and we purchased purchased Emflaza from Marathon, and that got approval in 2017 and launched in May 8th of 2017. And again, that's the only FDA-approved corticosteroid for DMD in the US. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to improve standards of care. And the term standards of care is important, and in particular in the context of clinical trials. Corticosteroids are considered part of standards of care, and those guidelines have come out over the past few years. So, so for you, it's information to talk to your physicians and ask the question about steroids, the risk-benefit analysis of having a child on steroids, but knowing that it's considered part of standards of care, that Emflaza is FDA approved, because overall, we're trying to improve the quality of life of patients and increasing disease awareness, understanding early diagnosis, and then, as someone mentioned earlier, understanding your genotype. So some of the molecules, like Adalimumab or like some of the other technologies, require the boys to have a very specific mutation. Okay, so understanding what your boy's genotype is will be very important as you work with your physician to try to understand what is available for your child. Okay, but for corticosteroids like the Deflazacort and Emflaza, that's part of standards of care for all boys with DMD. It doesn't require a specific mutation type, and part that's because it's working on the inflammatory response, which is part of the disease aspect of DMD. Okay. Next slide, please. So again, as part of our commitment to the Duchenne families, we have ongoing programs, and two that I'll talk about were the Peer Navigator program for families considering corticosteroids. You can meet and have greet with families that are on Emflaza. We also have the PTC's CARES program, support program. So if we can go to that next slide. So PTC CARES, there's two parts to it. There's patient support services and there's patient financial assistance. Now, the team from PTC CARES is great. I've worked with them. We've gotten great feedback from the community. So we certainly want you to reach out to PTC CARES with any questions you may have or any issues. And again, there's a number on the bottom left, 1-844-PTC-CARES. But what they offer is education, personalized case management, benefits investigation, prior authorization assistant, appeals, and that's on the support side. On the financial assistance side, there's copay assistance program, patient assistance program, patient foundation support, and the bridge program. Our goal from a PTC CARES perspective and a PTC in general perspective is that we want all boys on Emflaza to have continued access to the drug, and we do the best that we can to support you. So again, I encourage you, please reach out to PTC CARES if you have any questions. Next slide, please. So caring for a loved one with Duchenne takes a team, and it starts with you. And this is really where I just want to say that, you know, it takes a team, it takes a community, especially with COVID. We've all been separated for so long from all of our loved ones across the country, literally across the world. So know that, you know, you're not alone. And I think the discussions that we have on this panel session today really highlighted that fact that between the patient community, industry community, the patient advocacy community, we're all working together to do the best that we can for the boys. So working with your clinics, you know, your neurologists, your cardiologists, your care coordinators, it really takes a village. So, so again, please, you know, talk to your physician, ask questions. Knowledge is power. Okay, next slide, please. And I guess I just want to say thank you. And for questions, information, again, please contact PTC Cares Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or ptccares.com. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, John.
It's different doing it live. I'm used to doing the pre-recordings.
Yeah, it's kind of nice, right? We're pretending like we're in the real world. One day soon.
One day soon. Yeah, it'll be very
Yeah.
different when we actually do these live, like face-to-face again.
I know.
We'll
have to have a re-entry plan.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so excited for that day though. Can't wait.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see, I don't believe we had any questions that came in.
Okay.
So, you know, if anyone is on the line and does have a question, they know exactly to reach out to CARES, and we will point them over to PTC or go straight to PTC. So, yeah, so we're good for now. So,
Okay.
appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All
Have
right.
a good
Take
one.
care, John. Take
All
care.
right, you too.
Bye. All righty. Let's, Anna, let's see if you're working now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to leave my video off because my connection is so flaky.
Okay.
But I'm going to, I'm excited to share an update with you guys today.
Yes. Excellent.
My name is Anna Christensen. I'm a patient science liaison for Atal Pharmaco, and I'm going to be sharing an update about the Givinostat development program. So Carrie, we can go to the next slide. And so first, a few disclosures. So as you know from earlier in the talk, I'm an employee of a company called TRINS, which is a contract research organization. And Atal Pharmaco hired my company to help them with patient advocacy services. It's important to remember that Givinostat is currently not in development, is in development for the treatment of Duchenne and Becker, but it is not approved for sale in any country. And this presentation is intended to share scientific information with people like you. Next slide. 4 things to remember about the talk. So first, you should know that your muscle cells are supposed to repair themselves after they're damaged. And in Duchenne, this is one of the things that doesn't work properly. And Givinostat is an investigational drug designed to make the muscle repair process work more normally. And I'll show you some information from a phase 2 clinical trial, which showed that muscle tissue tests, functional tests, and pulmonary tests showed a delay of disease progression compared with natural history data. And last, our phase 3 trial is fully enrolled, and we're all looking forward to seeing results in 2022. Next slide. So there's this question of how do muscle cells repair themselves? And so this is a normal process that happens all the time. You're to do this just in the course of usual function. So you can click next, Carrie. So muscle cells get damaged, which sounds scary, but this is garden variety damage that happens all the time. This is things like I worked too hard at the gym, or I fell down, or things, damage that happens all the time. And when that happens, there's this, the inhibitory switch on the repairs gets removed, which allows the repair process to get started. So you can click next. And so once the repair mechanisms are allowed to proceed, once they're activated, that's what helps the muscle cells get back to their normal function. So you can click next. So that process is supposed to happen in your body all the time. So if you're someone with DMD, things are a little bit different. So if you have muscular dystrophy, you don't have the dystrophin protein, or if you have Becker, your dystrophin protein isn't perfect. And what that means is that it also affects your muscle cells' ability to repair themselves after damage. So here's how that plays out. So first, you get the damage just like you normally would, but that also happens more often because your muscle cells don't have the dystrophin protein. The signaling that's normally sent also doesn't work because those the parts of the cell that make the signals work hang on to the dystrophin protein. So when that happens, the signal doesn't work and the repair mechanisms don't work efficiently. So you can click next. And so what that does is it means that instead of repairing the cells like you saw in the earlier slide, scar tissue and fat cells accumulate, and it's that scarring and the fat that gets in the way of the function. And so that's what happens if you're someone who has Duchenne. And so at the end of this, you go back to the beginning and the process goes again. So here's how givinostat works. So givinostat does not do anything about your DNA or your RNA. So you're still gonna be missing your dystrophin just like you otherwise would be, which means that the signaling, natural signaling, doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. So you can click next. Givinostat acts like that missing signal, that signal that isn't working the way it's supposed to. And you can click next. And so by acting like that missing signal, it allows the muscle repair mechanisms to go, which then reduces the inflammation, increases regeneration, and reduces that fat and fibrotic replacement. So that's the idea. Givinostat doesn't change the problem in your DNA that gives you the Duchenne, but it does act like that missing signal to allow the repair mechanisms to move forward. So you can go to the next slide. So you've probably heard other webinars about the program, so I'm just going to review this at a really high level, and if you need more details or want recordings, you can reach out to Cure Duchenne, who's hosted several of them. So here's what we know about givinostat in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, is that in the mouse model, we see an increase in muscle fiber diameter, so the muscles are bigger. Muscle cells are bigger. You can see that the fibrosis and inflammation is less, which is a good thing. It shows that there are less fibrotic replacement and less inflammation that we know is a marker of the incorrect muscle repair process. The mice also do better on a treadmill test, so there's some functional change. And so then Ital Pharmaco took that information and used it to design a phase 2 clinical trial. And after 1 year of givinostat, we see similar findings on histology. So they looked at the muscle biopsy and they see that same increase in muscle fiber diameter and the same decrease in tissue damage, inflammation, and fat deposits. In addition, they also looked at muscle MRI and they saw a slower disease progression with givinostat compared to historical data. One of the interesting things about givinostat is it's been studied in other populations, not just Duchenne. So overall, we have data from over 500 people, and there's generally mild side effects, which include a reduction in platelet cell counts, diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting, and increase in triglyceride blood levels. We can go on to the next slide. So one of the things that happened with that phase 2 trial is the people who finished that trial continued on what's called an open label study. So they continue to receive active givinostat after their study participation. And so what that means is we can look at their long-term function and then compare it to some natural history data. So on the left, you'll see the natural history data, which shows from a group of people with Duchenne, at which point they stop being able to walk. So the average age is 13.4 years in that sample. So these are people who aren't doing anything new. They're just doing the test to see how their function is going. On the right, you can see the most recent data cut for the open label extension participants, and you'll see that the curve is the same, similar shape, but it's delayed. So their age at loss of ambulation is 16, which is later than the 13.4. So those are the kind of data results that you've been hearing about from our program. And so that's really interesting. We see similar patterns of delayed disease progression with pulmonary function testing as well. You can go to the next slide. So all of this led Ital Pharmaco to open a phase 3 clinical trial. And I'm going to walk you through that in a moment. You should know it was randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Carrie, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Emma.
Okay, good. So I'm just going to keep going while my Zoom has a hiccup. Then the primary objective was to demonstrate the givinostat preserves muscle mass and delays disease progression. As you probably heard, last year we finished an interim analysis which looked at the MRI data of the first 50 people after 1 year of participation in the study, and we found that the study was not futile. So what that meant is we knew we could continue with the rest of the study, and our enrollment completed in September of last year. And so at this point, no additional families can sign up, and everyone is continuing through the rest of the study, and we expect to have our final data in the second quarter of next year. So now we can go to the next slide, which shows how the trial was designed. So this was a phase 3 randomized controlled trial. So participants were boys ages 6 and older who were taking steroids, could walk, climb stairs, get up off the floor, and tolerate the MRI. And as with many other studies, they couldn't take investigational drugs or other specified drugs. And you can learn all the details on clinicaltrials.gov. And what happened is folks completed a screening process over about 4 weeks. And if everything looked good and that the family still wanted to continue, they got randomly assigned to receive either givinostat or a placebo for 72 weeks. And during that time, they had 2 muscle MRIs. And at the end, everyone was invited to continue in the open label extension study that I just told you about. So that's the overall plan of the screening, randomization period, and then the open label. So we can go to the next slide, which is study procedures. So as with many studies, a lot of these procedures will be familiar to you. Some of them may be similar to what you've seen in clinic. The ones that are different for research is that you always begin with informed consent, which is how you document your family's decision to do the study. There's physical examinations, a heart test, lung test, blood and urine tests. One thing you might not have done outside of a study is to do some questionnaires and a diary about symptoms. And then, as we discussed earlier, the functional testing is maybe similar to what people do in clinic, but a lot more controlled. So there's a lot more rules about how they're done so that we can get the data. And then finally, we are looking at the muscle MRI, which is a way of using magnets to take pictures inside the muscle. And as I mentioned, the study drug is an oral suspension, and it's taken twice a day after a meal. So we can go to the next slide about the open label extension study. So this study is a lot simpler. There are still more visits at the beginning than at the end, and that's because when people join the extension study, it's possible that they could have received the placebo in their previous study. So we want to make sure we're still doing all the safety checks that we need to make sure it's okay for people to continue. And the primary objective is to learn the long-term effects of givinostat on function, on strength, respiratory function, and daily activity and quality of life. So we can go to our next slide, which is about how things have shifted under COVID-19. So thankfully, first of all, we have not identified any safety concerns related to COVID-19 in our clinical trials. And in 2020, sites began using emergency procedures to ensure the right safety and well-being of trial participants continuous access to study drug, and also still maintain the validity and integrity of the trial so we can answer our research questions. And so what that means is that sites began using these emergency procedures that included things like allowing some safety tests to be done at home, some visits to be delayed, and then also shipping investigational drug to participants' homes. So if you're someone who's been on the trial, this is not news to you. I'm sure you've been working closely with your study coordinators. So if you're somebody who's on the givinostat study on the phase 3 trial, or if you're on the open label study and you're approaching an end of study visit or another kind of follow-up visit, I have an important reminder for you, which is that please try to attend your on-site study visits whenever possible, especially for your final visit of the randomized trial. The reason is that functional tests have to be done at the clinic to ensure that the data is valid. And without those tests, we won't be able to answer the research questions that are important to regulatory agencies and our researchers. And so our key message is please work with your study team about your concerns in your specific situation, because they're best positioned to help you with any requests for extra supports or change in schedules or anything else like that. Let's go to the next slide, which has our contact information. So as the other presenters mentioned, you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov, and I've put the study number there. So if you enter that in the search box, it'll show you this study. You can also watch one of our previous presentations, so the link is there as well, and several of them are up on Cure Duchenne. And last, you can also reach out to our team anytime by emailing patientadvocacy@atelpharmaco.com. You can go to our last slide, which is our thank you. And but most of all, research takes a village, and we really appreciate all of the researchers, all the families, all the trial sites, and all the advocacy groups that have helped us get this far with this program. We couldn't have done it without you, and just deeply appreciate you. So at that point, I think that's what I have, but I will open it up to any questions, and hopefully Carrie or Tiffany can read them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Anna. We actually don't have any that have come through in the time now. So what we'll do is just collect any and send them over your way, or we'll, again, let people know that they can email directly to the email that you provided, patientadvocacy@atelpharmaco. So
absolutely, we'd be happy to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. I appreciate your time today.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are now at the closing of our webinar today. Thank you to everyone who has stayed online. We have some upcoming events that all of these are listed on our website. We have our webinar next week on the 22nd with PepGen, one of our latest investments. So please join us to hear from PepGen's CEO, James MacArthur. On April 24th, we are restreaming on our Doug DMD channel on Twitch. So for all of you gamers out there, please log on to twitch.com/Doug_DMD and join in on the fun with our gamers. And then we have a couple of cocktail events on May 7th, apologies, we have a cocktail talk, and then on June 5th, we have a coffee talk. So hope to see you guys on those events. And then we are super excited, our Duchenne family reunion. We're scheduled to be here in Dallas, not far from my home, for our Futures National Conference. That's the weekend of October 8th through the 10th. You can find details on our website on that as well. So do save the date. The hotel is available if you want to make reservations now. All of that's already available, and you can access that information on our website as well. So I hope to see you guys all there. How great and hopeful to have all of that in person. So, and our Cure Duchenne Cares program wouldn't be made available without our sponsors. So big shout out to all of our sponsors who help provide the Cure Duchenne Cares program to the Duchenne community. So thank you all so very much, and looking forward to seeing you all very, very soon. Take care.